Are you a dinosaur who was a fan of The Lord of the Rings even before the first movie came out? Or maybe you played the first part of any of these games on a CD? Or maybe you at least read The Song of Ice and Fire before Game of Thrones made fantasy actually popular? In any of these cases, you might have some issues with more modern take on fantasy. And I'm not talking about DEI or any other political stuff. I'm talking about how the geek culture eventually led to the shallowing of the core essence of fantasy.
Well, wasn't expecting to fight an ogre today. Just one of those days.
Hi, I am Not-a-witchr, not that I ever was mistaken for one, but speaking about the universe of The Witcher. Unfortunately, it is one of the fantasy worlds that either receive a screen adaptation of questionable quality, like the Rings of Power or the Wheel of Time universes, or eventually change themselves into something unrecognizable to the original's fans, like the Dragon Age games or Dungeons and Dragons to some extent. Why is that, and what is fantasy losing because of that? These are the questions I will try to answer with my unsolicited opinion. First, let us consider the differences between geeks and nerds. I swear it is important for what I'm trying to say. Yes, the differences. I know it's 2025 already and all these memes can legally have sex now. It is important. So the main thing is that in the era before Game of Thrones, these two groups were not that commonly encountered in the wild actually. They were all seen as the odd funny dudes from the Big Bang Theory TV show, but most people were not eager to be considered a geek or a nerd. And only those who considered themselves to be one of these tribes knew the exact differences between the two. This is why these memes were created, for educational purposes. So in short, nerds are more introverted and more likely to get obsessed with the past, while geeks are more attuned to what's new and popular among their peers. Up to about 15 years ago, fantasy was kind of a niche genre in movies or TV shows, but sprawling and blooming in books and video games. But then, in the early 2010s, things started to change. There is a great video by Sarah Z, which explains this process in detail. Geek culture became popular. It was not a niche thing anymore, and many people were identifying themselves as geeks. But that did not touch nerds as much. There wasn't a wave of young people coming out as nerds. Probably because it was much easier and more socially acceptable to be a geek. You just had to have a geeky friends. And it takes a specific type of personality to be a nerd. After all, a spherical nerd in vacuum doesn't even have to have friends. But the important thing here is that those many young people that became geeks were naturally growing up and becoming, among other things, creators, authors, screenwriters, game developers, and critics. Now let's step aside and turn our gaze to another matter, the development of technology. That's right, it is also important for my point here. Remember how before the mobile phones and the internet, we were even thinking in other categories? Don't get me wrong, it's not a rant on how it used to be better when we talked to each other face to face instead of Twitter. I actually really like how these days I can download a 100 GB game in a couple of hours and how I pay everywhere with my phone instead of crumpled, sweaty banknotes. The thing is, our way of life strongly affects our imagination and our fantasies. I'm still talking about the genre. So, when a modern person thinks about miracles, they don't think about an ability to communicate over long distances. Any toddler with a phone can do that nowadays, even some cats. This is why, for example, later editions of Dungeons and Dragons include several spells that allow players to instantly send messages to anyone, even on other planes of existence. And those spells are not even the highest possible level. It became just a commodity in D&D.
The spell's limit is 25 words.
Remember Palantir? Remember how mysterious and magical this item felt in the books and the movies. Also Harry Potter. Did anyone use cell phones in Harry Potter? No. And they should not do it in the new adaptation. And what about, let's say, weapons of mass destruction? After the end of World War II, most of humanity knows that it is possible to make such a weapon that could literally destroy the world. So it stopped being an idea from ancient myths and religious texts. With time, it became somewhat familiar, even a trope. The very phrase, "the end of the world," is only used sarcastically. So, the more miraculous our modern technology is, the harder it is to imagine something truly impossible and magical. Many of you now are thinking about the most famous quote of Arthur C. Clarke's: "Any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic." I don't agree with that. You see, the only case in which this can be true is if a person, a character, does not know what technology is at all. Magic is, by definition, unexplainable and supernatural, be that power of a wizard or existence of dragons, and any technology is inherently understandable, because it was developed by some civilization, even if so long ago that nobody remembers anymore. The main difference here is in us, in the reader or the player. We know what technology is. We know that sometime in the future our posterity will use technology so advanced that we today can't even imagine its possibilities. But we know that it will be technology, not a gift from some god, not some dark power gained through human sacrifice. And our posterity will know it, of course, and will treat it with all the respect and awe that we today feel towards an ATM or an electric car. Now tell me, why should I feel like I'm reading, watching or playing fantasy when the characters use this indistinguishable from magic technology every day and don't even think about it that much? If their jaws do not drop, why should mine? Or remember when Star Wars tried to explain Jedi powers with some pseudo-sci-fi nonsense? Do you think it was a good idea? So I say that mixing sci-fi with fantasy will almost always result in something that does not have neither believability of sci-fi nor the magical feeling of fantasy. They kinda cancel each other out. And don't even start about Warhammer 40k. It's a whole separate discussion, because it has no sci-fi at all. It is techno-fantasy. No science, only faith, steel and gunpowder. By the way, let me know if you're interested in exploring this side of Warhammer. I wanted to make a video about both fantasy and 40k universes for some time now. But returning to the topic of this video. Remember those geeks that I was telling you about? Geeks love technology and fantasy as they understand it, and sometimes it's kinda a bit superficial. I often feel that nowadays many creators approach writing fantasy from their own paradigm instead of trying to imagine how the world would look and feel to the people living in those times and cultures, what those people would consider impossible and what those people believed in, something that a nerd would think about. This is a difficult question. How modern the psychology of characters should be in fantasy? Should they think just like us, have our values and political views? Would you even believe in a story where, for example, every commoner is always polite and civil? Would you really consider orcs people that have basic human rights? Or that would be basic orcish rights? And the main question, would such a story feel like fantasy that evokes this transcendent feeling of discovery, epic adventure and wonder? One of the main problems is stylization of speech of characters. Of course, the audience may understand your character more easily if they talk like a modern person. The wider audience, that is.
Did I just do that?
Well, definitely with my assistance.
I did not just do that.
We did.
I just moved shit with my mind.
Perhaps our connection has somehow awoken some abilities.
I just moved shit with my mind.
I just keep hearing I.
I just moved shit with my freaking mind!
But your characters can't just use modern words to describe modern concepts and expect it to feel like high fantasy.
Here, vegetables. Thank you.
So, I'm non-binary.
What does that mean?
I'm not saying that fantasy should be an exact copy of a specific historical setting from Earth, but I do say that fantasy should feel old in every aspect: psychological, cultural, and spiritual. Because the best fantasy is always told through its characters, not through the person of its author. Well, what do you think? In any case, thank you for watching this. Consider subscribing to my channel. I'm still not a Witcher, and as always, take care and farewell.